Hi, everyone. We'll wait another minute and then we'll get started. Hi, welcome everybody. I'm over at Palmer Commons today for the Michigan Integrative Wellbeing and Inequality Training Program. But today, Lynn and Victoria will be presenting. Do you guys have a preference of who goes first?
I can go first, Lynn.
Yeah, I can go first.
Oh, I said I was gonna go first. but-
Oh, yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Okay.
I didn't hear you, but I don't have preference.
Okay.
All right, Victoria, you should be able to share your screen and have hosting privileges. So let me know if you need anything, but
Okay,
Go
let
on
me see if I can do it. So can you see my screen? All right. Can you hear me well? Okay. All righty. Welcome everybody. Thank you for tuning in. And today, Lynn and I will share some of the results from some of the research we've been doing. In my talk, I will share some preliminary results from one of my dissertation aims. Just briefly, my overall dissertation examines chronic stress as one of the key underlying factors that contributes to systematic socioeconomic and racial health disparities. And in this aim, or in this work today, I specifically focus on the role of stress-related cognitions such as vigilance and stress coping in relation to metabolic syndrome. In the interest of time, I will only discuss the results around vigilance. So within epidemiologic research, the classic model of stress adaptation, originally formulated by physiologists Cannon and Sellier, has been among the dominant lenses through which stress health link has been examined, which this conceptual map trying to illustrate that overall stress adaptation framework. So according to the stress adaptation framework, stress is framed as a temporary neurobiological response to distinct stressors. For example, giving a public talk, like I'm doing right now. These stresses disrupt and otherwise or thought to be existing stable homeostasis or a psychophysiological balance through two major pathways. First pathway is conscious perception of stress and cognitive appraisal. And second pathway directly through activation of immediate physiological responses triggered by the activation of the central nervous system. This may manifest in symptoms we all can recognize, such as racing heart, shaking of sweaty hands or voice during while encountering a stress event. Both of these pathways lead to an orchestrated stress response, resulting in a temporary increase in various endocrine hormones and other adaptive responses. But when the stressor ends, which commonly doesn't last very long, our pre-stress balance will be restored, unless our ability to self-regulate is somehow compromised, in which case we may remain in a constant state of heightened stress, which is, according to stress adaptation framework, may lead to physical and mental health problems. Now, this stress adaptation model captures the essence of acute stress experience very well, but the model somewhat fails, when we try to use it to explain how such chronic stresses, such as, say, loneliness or poverty, that are not distinct events, could have significant impact on health. One hypothesis that has been put forth to explain the impact of chronic stress in the absence of clearly defined stress events is through the role of the mind. Specifically, it has been suggested that cognitive habits and tendencies, such as vigilance, stress-related coping, or other cognitive tendencies that people develop over time in light of their life experiences may either perpetuate or reduce the activation of the high stress response for positive or negative feedback loops. So a direct implication of this functional interdependence between stress response activation and cognitive tendencies is that even in the absence of clear and distinct stressors, the activation of a stress response may still persist. Existing research evidence on the relationship between vigilance and health disparities generally document a stronger associations between vigilance and self-reported health outcomes, but either no or weak effect on physical health. For example, Lavis and colleagues using the EDIC or the Exploring Health Disparities in Integrated Community study found that higher vigilance coping was associated with depression even after accounting for race, other demographic characteristics, and health status. Another study this research group did using the same sample found no association between vigilant coping or race-related discrimination and hypertension. A more recent study by Che, where Lavis was among the authors, found that race-related vigilance was associated with an increased symptoms of depression and anxiety among Asian and Black Americans during the COVID-19 pandemic. And finally, Margaret Hicken, using data from the Chicago Community Adult Health Study and the measure of racism-related vigilance, showed that higher reported prevalence of vigilance among Black participants as compared to whites or Hispanic groups. Vigilance was positively associated with sleep difficulties, but this association didn't vary by race. Note all of these studies used cross-sectional samples. So in light of the prior research evidence, I aim to examine longitudinal associations between stress-related cognitive tendencies such as vigilance and coping and cardiometabolic risk using a racially and socioeconomically diverse sample. I also propose to examine evidence for effect modification by race and social mobility. The study sample comes from the Healthy Aging and in Neighborhoods and Diversity Across the Lifespan study, which currently includes 3 waves of follow-up beginning 2004 and ending 2017. Handel's sample was recruited in 2 stages of baseline. First, an area probability sample was created using 13 randomly selected Baltimore City neighborhoods. And second, during a household interview, participants were selected into the study based on 4 demographic factors: race, total household income, age groups, and sex. On the right, you see a relative balance achieved at baseline using this strategy. Note that also the baseline, Also, the baseline sample was balanced in terms of sex or age. The sample did have higher percentage of Black participants, but lower percentage of those with household income below the poverty level. The primary exposure of interest was the measure of self-reported vigilance obtained at wave 1. So we used a 6-item modified MacArthur reactive responding scale, which was developed by Teresa Seaman and colleagues. In their paper that kind of details this scale or describes the scales, they say that the scale was developed with a purpose quote to try to get closer to understanding how SES gets under the skin, end quote. The original scale aimed to assess self-regulatory patterns that included vigilance, goal orientation, and emotional action. Handles included only vigilance, defined as a need to chronically monitor the environment for threatening cues, which may translate into being in a constant state of heightened alert. The handles use 3 original and 3 modified items, which I note in the slides. And so participants were asked the extent to which they agree with each of these items. For the main analysis, we created empirical tertiles of vigilance. Because this measure of vigilance has not been used very much in previous studies, we were frankly not sure what to expect in terms of this internal validity of this vigilance measure, and whether it's able to capture underlying construct of vigilance. So I created this table, which sort of suggests that the construct is seemingly behaving in the way we would have expected. For example, we see that high vigilance group also reports experiencing the highest self-reported stress, highest PTSD score on the validated PTSD symptom scale, and high depressive symptoms measured by CSD scale. Notably, participants with higher vigilance also have higher frequency of smoking or experiencing a cardiovascular event that includes stroke, heart attack, and other related conditions. The primary outcome is a calculated metabolic syndrome severity Z-score. The measure was derived using the enhanced study sample and we used 5 indicators of health status, shown on the slides. One of the key features of this measure is that it uses race and gender-specific formulas for score calculation, which is different from how we normally think about calculating metabolic status. So I calculated the score only among the participants who reported fasting. And finally, to develop an indicator for life course SES, I followed a strategy developed by a team of researchers using HRS sample. Specifically for child SES, I used 4 indicators of childhood environment, parental education, and living with parents at age 6 and 16. For adult SES, I used a composite score comprised of an indicator for annual adjusted household income, education, home ownership, and employment status. To create a four-way measure, all indicators were recoded, so higher values reflect higher SES and mean standardized. And then to create a four-way cross-product indicator for social mobility, which is our final kind of measure of life course SES, we median dichotomized adult and childhood SES summaries to create high and low categories, resulting in 4 social mobility groups that include stable low, stable high, and downwardly or upwardly mobile. Note that when we stratify this measure by race, one of the kind of focus of our study, we see that the higher percentage of Black participants were classified as belonging to stable low or upwardly mobile categories. The downwardly mobile group also has high percentage of Black participants, but it has the lowest number overall, which is what we expect to see. So it's unclear. So the low number is kind of suspect. Moving on to our results. So when we examine demographic characteristics of our sample by tertiles of vigilance, we see slightly higher percentage of Blacks in medium and high vigilance tertiles. And similarly, for our measure of social mobility, we see higher percent of those who are in persistent poverty or downwardly mobile in the medium or high tertiles of vigilance. And the opposite is the case for the upwardly mobile or stable high groups. So this table shows estimates obtained from a series of linear mixed effects models fitted with random intercepts and slopes and restricted maximum likelihood estimation of the variance parameters. Model 1 shows unadjusted results, while I'm highlighting model 4, which I consider the final model, where I adjust for basic demographic characteristics and interactions between them. Overall, we see a rather weak signal for vigilance, although in a somewhat expected direction. For example, over time, compared to the participants reporting low self-reported vigilance, those with medium level of vigilance show significant increase in their mean metabolic syndrome severity Z-score. But this wasn't the case for the highest tertile. And also interaction terms between vigilance and either social mobility or race were not statistically significant. But accounting for vigilance, we see a persistent main effect of race and interaction between race and social mobility. So here further illustrate some results from the tables. These are predicted trajectories, fixed effects of metabolic syndrome severity score by self-reported vigilance tertiles. And you see that the medium tertile of vigilance seemingly associates with a higher metabolic syndrome severity score at baseline and over time, which is as compared to the low group. But other than that, like the overlapping confidence intervals and tells the story of new or weak findings for vigilance tertiles. But when I plot these by race, we see a similar finding within Black participants only. We also see the main effect of race, where adjusting for vigilance, white participants have higher metabolic syndrome severity Z-score at baseline and over time compared to Black participants, which is a bit unexpected. When we plot vigilance by social mobility, we see no clear patterns emerging. So because of the significant effect of race and significant interaction between race and social mobility, I further explored this using three-way interactions. This graph helps show that the higher metabolic score among whites was seemingly driven by participants from stable, low, or downwardly mobile groups. We also see that high vigilance was particularly harmful for white participants from stable, low group. But this appears to be flipped for those in the downwardly mobile group. We also see white participants from stable, high SAS environment, or those who are upwardly mobile fare quite well compared to other groups. So the results you saw are still evolving. For example, I am yet to address potential concerns for bias that may have resulted from loss to follow-up. While multi-level regression models are able to handle missingness in the longitudinal outcomes as they use all available information, but in the case where the dropout may be informative, for example, when dropout is associated with the previous values of the outcome, I show this in the DAG at the bottom DAG, then the results will be biased. So I aim to multiply impute the outcome and see whether the results change. Other concern that exists is missingness in the baseline predictors. Again, I will try to use multiple imputation for predictors only and repeat the analysis. I also plan to repeat this analysis in the sample stratified by diabetes status. So our results are overall consistent with prior research. We see a weak signal for vigilance with respect to metabolic syndrome. This may be partially due to a quality of our measure, which was non-specific. It did have a fairly low alpha of 0.68. We measure vigilance at wave 1 only, which may further weaken associations. And additionally, some of our findings may reflect concerns related to missing data. We did observe main effect of race and metabolic syndrome score after adjusting for vigilance, although this was not in the expected direction. We saw white participants having higher metabolic score at baseline and over time, but majority of this seemed to be driven by the white participants from stable, low, or downwardly mobile groups, as we saw in this, when we fitted models with three-way interactions. So right now, I view these preliminary results being very much consistent with the Lincoln Fallon's fundamental cost model of health disparities. And this model, the fundamental cost model, divides causes of health disparities into distal or antecedent causes and proximal or surface causes. And according to the cost model of health disparities, distal or antecedent causes such as structural socioeconomic inequalities are believed to persist despite continuous changes and improvements in more immediate or proximal surface causes. So the measure of vigilance may be limited to the ability of capturing proximal or more surface causes only, which becomes silence in the face of overwhelming impact of race and socioeconomic inequalities. So that's it for now.
Do we have any questions for Viktoryia?
Hey, Viktoryia, I have a question. It's Jana. That was super interesting. I don't think I fully absorbed all the interactions, so you may have covered this, but as you said, it's kind of unexpected, right? That the medium vigilance was higher than low, but the high, it wasn't, like a monotonic increase. So I was just trying to think about, I wonder if you've read anything about resilience or expectations, and the people in the highest group of vigilance, it's just life. right? Like people who live in these neighborhoods where they're constantly exposed to these stressors maybe have some kind of adaptation, whereas the people who have them sometimes, but not all the time, aren't experiencing that. Have you come across anything like that?
Yeah, I mean, there is some, yes, thank you for your question and comment. It's definitely something that people hypothesized and looked into. There's no clear evidence or clear research studies that show necessarily these findings. Partly it's like, it's really hard to measure. How do we disentangle this effect, like overall the effect of the vigilance effect of the ability to toughen up despite the circumstances. And part of it is, again, it's like long-term exposure. How do we measure this exposure? Often it's just at one point in time. So yeah, I mean, the short answer is that I think there's a lot of theoretical models and theoretical writing about it, but the actual research studies showing clear results pretty much lacking from what I can see.
That makes sense, but something interesting potentially to dive into in your discussion a little bit.
Yep. Thank you.
Any other questions before we hand it over to Lynn? All right, thank you, Victoria.
Thank you.
Lynn, are you ready to go?
Yes. Are you guys seeing my screen?
Yes.
So hi everyone, my name is Linh Dang. This is just a talk for a conference that I will go to next week. So I will just give a talk as if I as the conference giving a talk. Today I will present my study on retirement, work expectation, and the trajectory of depressive symptom and passive suicidal ideation in baby boomer. And I have no commercial relationship to the close. And this study is funded by the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. So just a little bit of background. So as we know, the Americans are living longer. As such, they also retire at later ages. And the average retirement age is now rising to 62 to 65. Retirement expectation is a concept that related to subjective evaluation of the future. And it usually discussed in the context of economic and retirement planning. For example, like in this figure on the right, you can see like when older adults think about their retirement, they usually take into account of their insurance, their health, housing, saving account, or the lifestyle that they would want it when they retire. And when we talk about retirement and retirement expectation, baby boomer is an important cohort to mention. And when I talk about baby boomer, is anyone who were born between 1946 to 1964, and that is the US definition of the baby boomer. And they are the second largest age group, and it's estimated that 10,000 baby boomers reach retirement age every day. They are also the cohort that experience the Great Recession when they need retirement. So it's interesting to see how the retirement are being affected by the Great Recession or the economic crisis. And on the figure on the right, we can also see that they have the high rate of labor force participation, and this is consistent with their expectation of working past age 65. We know older adults have high risk of suicide, and retirement is an important transition in later life. So retirement and work transition can be an important stressor there are a few studies that looking at retirement expectation, and they documented relationship between retirement expectation and job stress or depression or life satisfaction. However, these studies, they have some limitation. So the first limitation is that they usually cross-sectional study design, and as such, it limits our understanding of how work expectation is related to the trajectory of mental health. And second, they usually focus on the mental health consequences of unmet expectation and realization. For example, if someone who wants to retire but could not retire, or someone who don't want to retire, but then they were forced to retire, then how that unmet expectation is related to the mental health. But the question that we are trying to address is, what if it's just work expectation without the context of unmet expectation and realization? How does that relate to mental health? And to our best knowledge, the question have not been addressed before in previous study. So one of the objectives of our study is to examine the longitudinal relationship between work expectation and depressive symptom and passive suicidal ideation in baby boomer in the US. We also looking at the relationship between working status at baseline and depressive symptom and passive suicidal ideation in baby boomer. So the data set that we are using is the Health and Retirement Study, or the HRS, and is a nationally representative longitudinal study of US adults over age 50 since 1992, and is oversample Hispanic, African American, and Florida resident. It's estimated that about 20,000 respondents are interviewed annually. And the HRS collect a wide range of data on the psychosocial characteristic, health history, economic circumstance, and employment history. And so since they have multiple measures of psychosocial characteristic and employment characteristic, it allows us to look at the relationship between work expectation and depressive symptom or passive suicidal ideation. So the work expectation, the exposure in my study is assessed by asking the respondent the following question. Think about work in general and not just your present job. What do you think is the chances that you will be working full-time after you reach age 62? And the response were on the scale of 0 to 100. But in this analysis, we scale it to 0 to 10 for a more meaningful interpretation. One thing to know is that the work expectation were asked at every interview weight. So this is a time varying exposure. So the mental health outcome in this analysis is indexed by the Composite International Diagnostic Interview, short form, or the CD. And this is a fully structured interview that assesses the past 12 months of depressive symptom. Is an 8-item measure where a higher score is indicated of more severe depressive symptom, and it has moderate concordant with clinical psychiatric examination. So there is 3 mental health outcomes we will consider. The first outcome is screening positive on the CD, and this is defined as whether the respondent, though they feeling depressed or loss of interest in the CD module. The second outcome is major depressive symptom, which is where they have at least 5 or more symptoms on the CD module. And the last outcome is passive suicidal ideation. And this is the last item of the CD. And it is assessed by asking the respondent whether they think a lot about death, either their own, someone else, or death in general. So our analytical sample is about 8978. And on the flowchart on the right is detail how we selected our respondent for the analysis. But briefly, we are only including HRS respondents who have both data on the work expectation question and the mental health outcome for at least one way between 2008 to 2018. And the reason that we chose the study periods is because the HRS only have reliable data on the CD since 2008, and 2018 is the latest interview data available for us. So that means the early baby boomer, the baseline for the early baby boomer will be 2008, and the baseline for mid baby boomer will be 2010. So we will use the mixed effect logistics regression to look at the relationship between work expectation and the three mental health outcome. And this statistical approach was chosen because it helps to take into account of the time varying aspect of work expectation and also the random effect of the HRS respondent. The covariate that we consider are interview weight, social demographic characteristics such as age, sex, marital status, education, household income and wealth, health behaviors such as smoking and drinking, health characteristics such as whether they have at least one chronic disease such as diabetes, cancer, or they also need help with the basic activity of daily life such as bathing, bathing, toileting, etc. And previous study has showed that walking is related to the better mental health outcome. So in this analysis, we also stratify by working status. So we will look at the relationship between work expectation and mental health outcome among those who are working for pay at baseline and among who did not. So now I will show you some results that I found. So in this figure, we are showing the unadjusted and adjusted, the odds ratio and the 95% confidence interval for screening positive on the CD, having major depressive episode, endorsing passive suicidal ideation. For every 10% higher expectation of working full-time after age 62 in unadjusted and adjusted for interview weight, social demographic, health behavior characteristic. And we can see from this figure that higher expectation of working full-time after age 62 was associated with significant lower odds of depressive symptom and passive suicidal ideation. And this still remains significant after we are accounting for working status at baseline. And in this figure, we are showing the odds ratio and 95% confidence interval of the three mental health outcome comparing respondents working for pay at baseline to those who were not. And we can see from this figure that respondents who working for pay at baseline were associated with significant lower odds of depressive symptom and passive suicidal ideation. And this is consistent with previous literature that say working is actually better for your mental health. So in this figure, in the y-axis, we are showing the mean predicted probability of screening positive on the CD, and the x-axis is the expectation of working full-time for after age 62, and the dashed line is among the respondents who working for pay at baseline, and the solid line is among respondents who not working for pay at baseline. And we can see that higher expectation of working full-time after age 62 was associated with lower probability of screening positive on the CD. And this is more pronounced, and this inverse relationship is more pronounced among the respondents who not working for pay at baseline. And similarly, we also see a inverse relationship between work expectation and the probability of having depressive symptom, of having major depressive episode. And this also more pronounced among the respondents who were not working for pay at baseline. We also find similar results with passive suicidal ideation, where the inverse relationship between work expectation and passive suicidal ideation is more pronounced among the respondents who are not working for pay at baseline. However, when we only look at the respondents who were screened positive on the CD, we observe no association between expectation of working full-time after age 62 and the probability of endorsing passive suicidal ideation. And we also found no substantial differences between the respondents who were working for pay at baseline and adults who were not. So in conclusion, we observe a lower odds of depressive symptoms and passive suicidal ideation associated with higher expectation of working full-time after age 62 among baby boomers in the US. And this inverse relationship were more pronounced among the respondents who were not working for pay at baseline. And this finding have practical implication, especially in time of the COVID-19 pandemic. There have been many news articles that writing about early retirement in baby boomer. For example, in this article, there's one of the interviewers was saying that she did not want to retire, but then they feel like they didn't have other option to choose. And this is a tale of two retirement where on one hand, we have people with more financial security where they can afford to retire early. But on the other hand, we have low income or racial ethnic minority who do not have saving or like financial security to retire early. And they have to rely on Medicare or Social Security trust fund to fund their retirement if they want to retire. And we know due to social safety net program has been deteriorating during COVID-19 pandemic, and this have implication not only for their retirement expectation, but as our finding suggested, it also have implication on their mental health. And this is my preference. And thank you for listening. And if you have any question, I can answer any question that you may have.
All right, well, thank you, Lynn.
Thank you for listening.
Thanks for being here, everyone. We'll see you again in 2 weeks. Have a good day.
Thank you.